Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of hippoBrain, where we have hippo-sized conversations with hippoBrains. And our hippoBrain today is a person I've known for 30 years. We'll probably talk about that if we get a chance in our conversation. He was one of the first persons I had met after I returned from the US way back in 92. Mahesh is also a very good friend. We've known each other for a long time. But today we are going to talk about Mahesh as MD and CEO of Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. CMIE has the best data on Indian corporates and the economy. It's trusted more perhaps than the government data that's put out. And we're going to dig deep today in understanding on how the whole data, databases, analytics, storytelling process works around arguably what's probably the biggest data set that one can ever have in the country. Welcome to hippoBrain, Mahesh.
Thank you, Rajesh. It's my pleasure to be on this show. Thank you for calling me a hippoBrain.
So let me start with sort of the very fundamental question. Why do we need to monitor the Indian economy? And isn't that the job of the government? What's CMIE doing in that?
I think that's a wonderful question. It's a total bouncer to me. What is CMIE doing in this space? And I have a tough time to explain this to anyone I meet. I had a tough time explaining this to my family. Where am I working and what am I doing? What is this monitoring the Indian economy? So that's true. I mean, data, statistics, as we understand them in a classical sense, are public goods. And they have to be created by the government. And that's the case all over the world. Nobody can privately own the GDP estimate of the country, for example. So it is the role of the government to create statistics as a public good that everyone can use and everyone can use without any controls of any kind. So CMI has no business to be in that. And CMI began as a think tank, as an organization that took the data, processed it, figured out what's going on, and then telling people what is happening in the Indian economy. But as we went by and saw that the government was not doing an adequate job in the collection and dissemination of data, we gradually got into that role and started to collect that data. And that became one of the most important tasks we did. So we landed over there because our profession required us to have the raw material supplied properly so that we could do our work correctly.
And if I look at it today, I mean, rarely a week goes by without CMIE being mentioned in pretty much every business newspaper. The investment numbers in the Indian economy come from y'all. The unemployment rate, which is incredible. You would think that the unemployment number should actually be coming from the government, but the only number which is trusted in India is the CMIE number.
Yeah, I think this is, you picked the right one. So I don't think there is any country in the world where the government does not produce the unemployment rate on a monthly basis and a private organization does it. We are the only weirdos in the world who seem to be doing this. So we are the only chaps who are collecting data and producing a weekly unemployment rate and a monthly unemployment rate, and then of course the rest of it all as well. And I'm happy to note that after we started doing that, the government is playing catch up. So it realizes that it cannot leave this field to a private agency, what is essentially a public good, and has started doing it. But I guess now they are far behind us, and we have started doing this unemployment rate. It has also caught up a lot because of the pandemic, because of demonetization, because of GST, because of the economic shocks that India witnessed in the past 6-7 years. And the first place that the hit was seen was in unemployment. So we were the first, for example, to say that demonetization has caused a loss of 3 million people on a sustained basis. Initially, about 12 million jobs were lost. Many of them were recovered, but on a sustained basis, we seem to have lost 3 million jobs. So when you quickly come up with this number, then it catches on, and then the media catches on. And then, interestingly, what happened is the establishment got after us, and we came more into the limelight. So then when the official numbers came out, we were proven right, and our credibility was established. One thing leads to the other, and now, today, we started unemployment capturing from 2016. So 5 years later on, after we began this, we are a very well-established, credible, people to believe us when we say that the unemployment rate after the lockdown shot up to 24% and then came back to 6% and so on and so forth. So we're able to weave a story that brings in a lot of credibility. People do believe us. Media believes us. Even the government believes us now.
So Mahesh, when I studied economics, I used to love the simple economics, demand, supply curve, equilibrium. It was amazing. Whenever anybody went into macro and all these numbers started coming in, honestly, when I was in college, I looked at it with not a pinch full of salt, with a bag full of salt. कि मेरे को एक बात समझाओ, how can anybody calculate unemployment rate? Means how is it possible? What, you go door to door knocking, the census strikes once in 10 years. How do you manage to come with this data and say 3 million? Sometimes, of course, the numbers are 3,33,462, but which I have never understood. So let me even understand it. 3 million kahan se aata hai, and what goes into getting this number out, and to a bystander, give me some confidence that we should believe in that number.
Well, Jayant, I just spent the last 5 minutes saying that there's great credibility now. So people are believing us. So you still want me to say how I do it and how I'm right. I'll tell you what happens. So there is some science behind this. So there is the science of statistics, which is nowadays got a more fashionable name like big data, etc. So we don't do things that we call as big data, but we do what is classical statistics. That if you pick a sample of households or respondents from a large population like India, we have more than 1 billion people. If you pick a reasonably random sample which is large and representative, then the inferences you draw from such a random sample is a true reflection of the population. So what we do is we go out and collect a sample through a process called stratification. Stratification means we cut up the country into different parts, and then we ensure that we reach out to all of them, collect the data honestly, bring it back, and then we use weights. That one observation is actually representative of so many lakh real people. And by the use of these weights, because this is a stratified random sampling, we're able to come to a number like 3,033,467 or whatever are unemployed, etc. So it is the science of statistics that is at play to make these estimations.
So, just a follow-up question. I do appreciate the back-end statistics, but my assumption also that it would require a huge field force on the ground going and asking the relevant questions all across India, because when you're looking at unemployment data, you're also looking at rural and urban. So various small places, various small shops, various small industries where that would be affected, and the larger ones may be easier. So how does this work on a data collection at the ground level? I would assume that logistics would be crazy.
Yes, the logistics can be crazy. So we have used a combination of very good human resources, very good structure, which is there all over the country. So we have, my colleagues are there all over the place from Kashmir. We have a person in Srinagar. Till recently, we had an office there. So from Kashmir, and in South, we have got an office in Madurai. We have an office in Cochin. We have an office in in Ahmedabad. We have one in Guwahati. So we cover the entire country. We are there in several places. There are about 300 people on the feet, going from village to village, town to town on a regular, everyday basis, collecting the data. So, there is a large field force, which is also managed in a structured, layered fashion. But besides that, there is a fairly good use of technology. So we ensure that the data we collect is necessarily in electronic format. It is necessarily collected digital. There's no paper and pencil anywhere. Data is collected and therefore validated on the spot. It is validated then by the supervisors in near real time and uploaded by the end of the day. So because of this, we have cut out a lot of the intermediate human resources that were necessary in the olden days. For example, the NSSO has got a different quality control department where lots of people are sitting checking the data. We eliminate that because we use real-time online checking mechanisms. We use statistics and paradata on the fly. So it's a mix of good human resources, very intense training, good technology, and pressure from the market that we expect the unemployment number to come out tomorrow. A combination of these things make it possible.
Mahesh, let's dig a little bit into the data. One of the innovations that you did at CMI was to shift from the supply side data, which has been there on agriculture, industry, services, to the demand side. And that also represents sort of the structural change in India or the evolution of the Indian economy. Talk us through that.
Well, that's an interesting question. So, let's first look at the concept of GDP. So everyone talks about the GDP is growing, the GDP is growing slowly, the GDP is accelerating, and so on and so forth. What is the GDP? So sorry for bringing these basic things in this discussion, but I think it's important to understand this.
I think it's very good. I think I was going to ask you this question.
Same here. Moment Rajesh asked that question, I was like, Mahesh, I just hope you go really low and then explain. Perfect. You're going absolutely right. Thank you.
Something rang in my head and I said I should explain this. So nowadays, we call it the GVA and the GDP. So the GVA and GDP are basically, let's call it the same thing, the GDP. The GDP is gross domestic product. And let's look at this as having two sides, the supply side and the demand side. So the supply side is how much do we produce every year? So how much agriculture do we produce? How much industrial goods do we produce? And how much services do we produce every year? If you add up all these things, then we will say that we have so much of the GDP produced, the supply side, which is now called the GVA or called the gross value added. That's only a technicality, but that's a supply side. How much of agricultural produce, how much industrial produce, how much services did we produce? And then all of this gets consumed. So this is classical economics. So you have people who will consume this as what is called as private final consumption expenditure. Then some of what is produced will go into investments. Like let us say some steel goes into making machines, making construction, so on and so forth. And so besides consumption and investments, you will have exports and imports, and there will be some government consumption. Now, the reason why I gave you this long story is that traditionally in India, the collection of data was very good on the supply side. So the Britishers had set up a very good system of estimating agricultural production. They also required this for tax collections, but they have very good systems which are true even today. And I think those systems are working well. Similarly, after industrialization, after 1950, etc., we set up good mechanics to estimate industrial production in India. So agriculture and industry were taken very good care of by the statistical machinery. Services was taken care of, but not as much. And services grew very rapidly. And our statistical systems are behind the curve on that. But even then, after all this, the supply side statistics is well covered. And we used to always say, when GDP growth means how much agriculture, how much industry, how much services. In our good old days, 20 years ago, etc., that's what we said. But now, there is another side. It always was there, but we never collected data, which is consumption expenditure, investments, and export, import, etc. That was always deduced from the supply side statistics. Even today, mind you, we don't have a direct way of calculating consumption expenditure except once in 5 years, and now unfortunately it is now less than even once in 10 years. So there is a big gap in actually knowing what is consumption in India. And similarly, there is no direct calculation of how much investments are happening in the country. So while the statistical machinery took good care of the supply side, it was grossly failing in directly estimating the demand side. So what CMI did is it started fixing the demand side on its own. And the first thing we did, which is what began even in 1980 or so, or rather 1980 or so, is the CapEx database. What we used to call then as the shape of things to come, became the established system of understanding what is happening to investments in India. So CMI solved the problem of investments by capturing investments correctly through its CapEx mechanics. But 65% or more of India's GDP is all consumption. And it was heartbreaking that we, after having grown so well after the 1990s, still don't have a direct way of calculating consumption expenditure. So in 2014, much before that, in 2011 or so, CMI started the process of setting up the household survey machinery to actually estimate consumption expenditure. In 2014, that took good shape, and since then we have been capturing data on household incomes, which nobody else calculates, household consumption expenditure, and that consumption expenditure and investment fills in the gap on the demand side of the economy. So that's how we have this macro view that we're going to get India's GDP right, we've got to get India's economy right, we've got to monitor it right. We know what the supply side is, but we are guessing what's happening on the demand side. So our big desire was to fix that, and that's what we have done. This is a long answer, Rajesh, to your question, but I think, I hope I have answered the question you were asking.
This is very, very helpful. And if in a way, it also, you've traced the sort of evolution of CMI. Okay, CMI started as a think tank, like you had said. It became in the middle a database company. And now what you're doing is the solutions on top of the database, on the data that you're gathering. So on one side, there is the data side, and then there's also the storytelling, which you do through your regular columns in Business Standard every Tuesday. So talk us through this. So all this data is coming in. What happens to this data? One side, I'm sure a lot of people come to you and say, Mahesh, tell us what's happening. Okay, you've got the largest repository of data now, both on the supply side, on the demand side. How do businesses, government people, policymakers use this data, and how do you communicate with them?
It's an interesting question, Rajesh. So CMI has evolved. Yes, we began as a think tank, and as the demands on the think tank were increasing, we figured that we require better data to think through what's happening to the Indian economy. And therefore, per force, we had to go and build those databases. And we took an early decision that let's make this data also available. So it's not just the data that we are consuming, then telling people what is happening, but people should have the data also. And that led to the business of selling data, and CMI became a data company. It still fits into monitoring. It still fits into tracking what's happening to the Indian economy. And we were happy to give out this data. But for a very long time, delivery of data became our core business. Then came a time when we said that we require to also give our customers, and we are a private company, and so we have customers. We are not funded by anyone. We have to go out and get subscriptions to our databases. And we started building tools for analysis. But we figured that there are zillions of people making analytical tools, and we said, let's step back and get into and customers are telling us, tell us what is happening. So there were demands on us. Can you come and talk to us? Can you come and give us a presentation? So on and so forth. So we shifted and said, let's shift into saying, we produce data, we give you data, and we tell you what the data is telling you. So we got into the storytelling system, which are services, which is Economic Outlook, States of India, Industry Outlook, etc. All of them give you tons of data and tell you the story that that the data tells you. So I write regularly, and my colleagues write regularly for our services. I also write a column for Business Standard, which has got some traction, but most of my writing is available in the CMI services because we want to tell, and clients want to listen to, what is CMI's narrative on the Indian economy, which is oftentimes very different from what the government's narrative is or what the established narrative is.
So we had a hippoBrain once, and he spoke about three types of data people. People who clean data, the engineering side, the modeling side, and the storytelling side. And it's very interesting because Anindya was one of our earlier hippoBrains, and I found it extremely fascinating. And as I went and then on this journey with various different hippoBrains, I'm realizing this third element of the storyteller is becoming even more relevant, and more hippoBrains talk about storytelling becoming very important. Storytelling is very important. Now, Mahesh, you obviously write those stories and you think these stories. How do we replicate Mahesh's around? To my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that there is enough on the engineering side. There is data. Of course, there is a science of collecting the data, which I don't want to undermine. But there is, Indian corporates have this data. The second is, there is enough modelers also, according to me. Modeling bhi bhar bhar ke hai. Tumko, modelers can prove probably anything you want to. So that's also one part of it. And I think that's also largely a solved problem. To my mind, the data storyteller is not a solved problem. Now, I have 2-3 questions. One, how much do you invest into storytelling? How important is it? And what percentage of your customers are coming and saying, give me the data, I'll make my own stories? Or how many are coming and telling you that, please tell me a story around it and make sense of it for me? And how does this interplay? So I just want to spend a little more time on this because these have very valid implications for even boring corporate jobs like me.
Well, insofar as our customers are concerned, we have all kinds of customers. So a fairly large chunk of our customers are university people, academics. They obviously are interested in saying, just give us the data and then we will do our analysis. And we play a fairly important role even over there, Jayant. You know, it's important not to tell them the story of storytelling that we would tell a corporate client. But they want us to tell them the story of how was the data collected? What is the story in that data that you're getting? How is that question asked in your survey? How exactly are you getting those flows from stocks that you are putting together? So we have fascinating stories, exchange of stories on data with even the academics. They're very different kind of stories. And I think it is fascinating how valuable this is and how valuable they find it when they spend time talking to us on how did the data come to be the way it is. Now, mind you, in the olden days, sorry, I'm kind of ancient, but in the olden days, there was little data. And over a lifetime, you could kind of master it. If you knew the NSSO data, you knew half of all the data of the government of India. If you knew the ASI data and the national accounts data, you were the king. You could rule. You knew everything. There was very little to learn. Today, there is really a lot of data. Our services deliver things like dozens of millions of time series. So one of them delivers some 26 million time series, another one delivers some 7 million time series, and so on and so forth. So there's so much data that getting to learn all of them is next to impossible. So we have interesting stories to tell them. But I think your first question, how do you replicate storytellers like Mahesh? I think that's important. And I spent a good amount of time trying to train people to do the storytelling. The first thing that is important over here is not to come with a priori belief. If you come to believe that only this theory works, a Marxist theory works, or a free market theory works, or we necessarily should have one way of the economy and not the other, then this is not cut out for you. You need to understand basic economic theory more in the sense of how the various elements of the economy work together, not to explain a model of how the economy should be organized. That's the problem. If you start talking about how the economy should be organized, you can't be a data scientist. And this is more about being a data scientist in the field of economics. So it's very important to look at the data and try and understand what is the data telling you. Try to look at what is happening to the economy outside the data. Look at what other people are talking about when they're talking about the economy, and what is the data telling you. You need to hear what people are telling you. You need to know what is happening in the economy, and then you got to look at the data, stare at it, and make sense of it. Try various things. But I think if we ask the questions correctly, if we don't ask the questions which are leading to an answer that you're interested in, that's the biggest mistake people make. If you ask an honest question, you will get an answer which will be brilliant. Now, you will come to answers which are not coherent. You get one answer over here, another one over there, and the two of them don't stand together. You're going to work harder to solve that problem. But instead of doing some jugaad, it's important to try and face the animal that they don't work out and give it some time to make it work out and tease out a story from the data. I do it every day, and it's great fun.
Mahesh, give an example of this. Sometimes you're looking at the numbers, maybe, right after demonetization or perhaps after the lockdown, and the numbers, we all have our own sort of mental models, assumptions of what's happening. And suddenly you see the numbers, and somewhere maybe there is a disconnect. And eventually you have to, of course, trust the numbers rather than your own instinct or intuition. How do you balance the two?
Okay, so let me give you a good example of unemployment. Till I went out collecting data for unemployment in India, I had never studied the labor markets of India. And the reason was very simple. There was no data on the labor markets. So the NSSO surveys were really ancient, and they didn't interest me at all because they're so old. I didn't get interested. My interest was in the corporate sector, in understanding balance sheets and profitability and so on and so forth, and investments and so on and so forth. Labor was never interesting to me. So I accidentally got into this labor market thing and started calculating unemployment. I began this work in 2016. The unemployment data started coming out in the month of May of 2016, and we gave the back series from Jan onwards. So we released the data somewhere in the middle of May, and in November 2016, which is about 6 months after we had just started releasing unemployment data, we were hit by demonetization. Now, when the economy is put under such tremendous stress, what do we expect? If the unemployment rate was around, let us say, 4 or 5% or so, or let us say 5 or 6%, or whatever it was, you would expect that unemployment rate to shoot up, obviously. And what did we see? I think the numbers were 8 to 9% before demonetization, and they fell to 4 and 3%. And I said, what? And I was frozen to my machine to say, this is my data, in the sense that my organization, and I'm leading this, collecting the data. The first thing I said, am I making a mistake somewhere? Is the data wrong? This can't be true. So I really squeezed the machinery to check if anything is wrong anywhere. So is it some godforsaken place where we are making a mistake? Are the weights going wrong? Are the programs going wrong? I was perspiring. I was in cold sweat. And I found out that the data is not wrong. All my colleagues were saying all right things. And if the boss says the unemployment rate cannot go down, it should go up, somewhere down the line the team will say, okay, we'll make it go up. That's horrible to happen. I had to be sure I don't make that mistake. And so, we went on scrubbing the data until I found out that the culprit is in the labor participation rate. This is a very good example, Jayamit and Rajesh, that the problem was when there was the severe shock, people just exit the labor market. They stopped looking for jobs. And what is the unemployment rate? Now, this is important. The unemployment rate is the people who are unemployed and they're looking for jobs and not finding it. They have to be looking for jobs and not find it. As a percent of all those people who have jobs and are looking for it. But what if people just exit the market and stop looking for jobs? When that happens, your ratios are changing by the denominator changing in a big way, that the change in the numerator doesn't make a difference. And the unemployment rate goes down. I said, oh my God, can this be right? And I had to go hunting. I'm not trained to understand. I wasn't trained in those days for sure to understand this. It took me a couple of weeks to scrub the data, to be sure I'm right on this, to see state by state, rural, urban. The story was the same. The labor participation was falling down. And then I wrote, the story is the labor participation is falling down. That means there is so much stress that people are leaving the labor markets. So initially people were, saying what? And I was giving TV interviews and explaining, nobody could understand what is this labor participation rate. And I think I can claim some credit for having made economists go back to the textbooks and reread again what this labor participation rate is. And it did lead to the story, and the story holds true even today, that the unemployment rate is not the correct measure to look at when you're looking at India's labor markets. The more important number to look at is the labor participation rate. And therefore, we had this employment rate, which is an even more important number to look at. And I write a lot to say, look at the employment rate. The unemployment rate is less important. This is an example of how you crunch the data, and you don't have an a priori understanding that if there is a shock, there has to be a rise in unemployment. It has to be the reverse. Now look at this. Sorry, I'll continue a little more on this too. We learned this lesson in demonetization. When there's a shock, it's not that the unemployment rate shoots up, but it's the labor participation rate that falls down. That falls down and therefore brings the unemployment rate down. The next big shock that came was lockdown. And what happened? The unemployment rate shot up to 24%. I said, no, it should be going down. But no, this fellow shot up to 24%. And what did I do? This was, I think, the week of 24th March, 2020, when we said that the unemployment rate is shot up to 24%. I did not release that number. I was again sweating cold to say, no, this can't be true. But then we checked the numbers and we found, yes, the next week is also 24%, and the next week is also around 24%. It remained there for 2 months. And then it crashed. And then I had the guts to release that the number is 24%. And then the story became very clear what was going on. But this is the story, that if the data collection machinery is good, and if it doesn't have a bias beforehand to say, what do you expect the numbers to tell you? It tells you a fascinating story. In the two great shocks, it shocked me. It shocked the hell out of me, and then gave a fantastic story. And I'm happy I didn't merely give the data out, but I even sweated over it to give a story out.
Mahesh, 1 second. This story is extremely fascinating and important. Let me try and help me understand it. In the demonetization, there was a sense of despondency in some sense. So people didn't want jobs and said, they wanted jobs, but they said, kuch nahi ho sakta hai, main baith jata hu. कोई hope ही नहीं है, चुपचाप घर पे बैठो. So I don't want a job. That's why I'm not in the employment seeking market. And hence you saw the data where actually unemployment was actually going down, right? Okay. Why did the same not happen in lockdown? वो मुझे नहीं समझ में आया. I would have assumed that in lockdown there would be similar despondency, or was it not there?
The shock in the lockdown is very, very high. So a very large proportion of the population, the working population, was sitting at home. And they were saying that we want jobs desperately because we don't have anything to eat now. So in the demonetization part, the story was a little different. They were saying, leave the job. Now, I'll tell you what happened in the demonetization part. The shock was absorbed by two categories of labor. One is women. And they just quit the labor market saying there's nothing happening over here. We are not going over there. And youngsters. So people in their 20s said, we are quitting this market. Whereas in the lockdown period, even a 30-year-old man, not just a woman, had lost jobs, and he could not say that I'm not looking for a job because there was no rosy roti at home. Livelihoods were lost. When women and children or youngsters were leaving the labor markets, it wasn't hurting the livelihoods as much. So the story is in the livelihoods part. In the lockdown, the livelihood hit was so big that people said we desperately do want jobs, and therefore there was this big spike that happened in unemployment. So we also see this in the income data. The incomes of households just collapsed in April and May and even June. In that first quarter, there was a big fall in incomes, and that's when people said we can't afford to not do anything at home. We do want jobs.
Mahesh, one of the recurring themes in what you've written is actually the participation rate of women in the workforce. And that in India is actually abysmally low. Tell us about that. Why is that the case? And are there are there things that can be done to sort of change that?
Harish, I'd like to answer a different question. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
But a related one. So this is cheating. You asked me one question, I'm answering another one. And I've reminded many people to do that, and I don't like it. But I think this is relevant. So, there is a big difference. There's a big difference between the labor participation rate for women calculated by us and the labor participation rate calculated by the government for women. So they say that the female labor force participation rate is of the order of some 24% or so. It is falling over time, like we are saying it is falling over time. They say that the labor force participation rate for men is of the order of 74% or so. We have no difference with the official machinery on labor participation rate for men. We are both at around 74%. Plus minus 1-2 percentage points here and there, but we are broadly in that same orbit. But for female labor participation rate, they are saying around 23-24%. We are saying 10%, or even less than 10%. Now, that's a huge difference. Now, the reason why there's this big difference is in the definition of what is labor participation. And here I'd like to tell you a story where we at CMI differed with the establishment, and we continue to maintain our position. According to the ILO guidelines, it's a guideline, and a guideline that India follows, like many other countries do follow. A person is considered to be employed if the person was employed for even half a day in any of the preceding 7 days. Okay? And suppose the person was employed for half a day in the preceding 7 days, And in the remaining 6.5 days, he was desperately looking for a job and not getting it. He is still classified as an employed person. If a person was seeking employment and not getting it for half a day in the preceding 7 days, he is considered unemployed and not outside the labor force. Okay? So the precedence is given to employment, and then the precedence is given to a part of the labor force and not outside. And out of the labor force is given the least preference in case of a disagreement. Now, we say that we don't do the 7-day business because in India, 80% of the people or even 90% of the people don't have regular jobs like you and I have. They are daily wage earners. They could be employed today, not employed tomorrow. They could be looking for a job today and not looking for a job tomorrow. So giving this 7-day period and doing this precedence of just half day over 7 days is all bogus according to me. So it's more honest, it's more correct, and I'm using very strong words over here, that I go to the household today and I ask you, Rajesh, are you employed today? And if you say yes, it's a very clear answer. If you say no, I say, are you looking for a job and not getting it? You say, yes, I'm looking for a job, not getting it. I'll say, okay, you're unemployed. If you say, I'm not looking for a job, I'll say, okay, you're out of the labor force. It's very clear cut. So by doing this very clear cut way of making estimates of in the labor force or not in the labor force, for men, we get the same answers. NSSO and CMI get more or less the same answers. For women, we don't. That means women who are considered as employed by the official statistics and as per ILO guidelines is based on too thin a definition. I'll call it too flimsy a definition. If a woman spends half a day milking the cow in a household where the household also sells the milk, the woman is considered employed. I don't think that's fair. So we say no, that woman is not employed. That woman is doing some work. So we have also been very careful in saying women do work. Certainly, in fact, it's very possible that they work more than men do work. But that work is not employment. So this long story is to say how CMI makes a distinction and probably adds to our understanding of labor force participation. Now, the question, why are women not employed? Why is it that the labor force participation rate is so low? I think we discriminate against women. Indians are not happy hiring women compared to hiring men, and there's a discrimination. Why do I say that? 3 pieces of data. One, in the last 5 years, the number of graduating women is slightly higher than the number of graduating men. Okay? So the number of graduating men is lower than the number of graduating women. Yet, women labor force participation rate is very low, around 10% compared to 75% for men. That means even after good education, women are not coming into the labor market. Now, if you have got a very low labor force participation rate, shouldn't you find it easier to find jobs because very few women are going out, but still they've got a much higher unemployment rate than men. So equally educated, not coming equally into the labor market, yet finding it extremely difficult to find jobs. This can only be explained by discrimination. So the first thing, and I'll say this very strongly, is that Indian enterprises do not give an equal chance to women who have the same education. The second point I will say is that India is failing in providing adequate facilities for women to work safely. Jobs are increasingly found farther and farther from your residence. They're not found in the close proximity. So if you have to travel from far and come back home, if it is late in the evening, the sense of security is not there or is declining, and that dissuades women to seek jobs that are far from their residences. So at least these things, I think these are the two most important things. Is one, it could be cultural, that men don't allow women to go out to work, or women believe that society does not want them to work. We need to test that. And enterprises don't give women enough opportunities. Finally, our infrastructure fails them. So this is the answer I'll give for why India has such an abysmally low labor force participation rate for women. Mind you, India is 10, Bangladesh is 33, 34. So it's a shame to us that our numbers are so low.
Wow, these are crazy numbers, Mahesh. And I think when we were talking about it, I remembered the lady milking the cow at home, and you're calling it employed. And one of the economic terms my teacher had taught me, I think in 11th or 12th standard, was disguised employed.
Disguised unemployment. Yeah.
Disguised unemployment, correct. You are theoretically employed, but you're not adding to the productivity of the nation, the family, or anything. So this 7-day window in half a day, I think, is what makes that difference and captures this. So if I were to work backward, 15% of women are disguised unemployed.
Well, maybe. I mean, they, mind you, one thing very important, they do work a lot.
They do work a lot. They do work a lot.
They take care of everything at home. And many of them do 3 shifts. They cook, they clean, they take care of children and elders at home. And many of them do go to work after all of that. So hats off to women, they do a lot of work. But nevertheless, India is almost unique amongst reasonably sized countries to have an abysmally low female labor force participation rate, and still a falling one. Mind you, one more thing. Female labor force participation rate is particularly low in urban India.
Okay, this is interesting. Explain.
Well, that's it. I mean, women do, see, in rural India, you have to go to work on the fields. Right?
And productive work on the fields.
And
correct.
productive work on the field. We do see that. I mean, they are aggressively working in the field. If you see the picture of women picking tea leaves, it's always a woman picking tea leaves. And many other places. In urban India, women seem to be more reticent to go in and get employed.
It's extremely, extremely interesting. And I'll give you a very short story. What happened was, a couple of weeks back, my wife and daughter were tested positive. Okay, they're all good right now, and we're lucky. And I was the one who didn't get it. And and it was my job to work and take care of the kitchen and clean the house and everything and manage and keep the food. And you know what? I really thought I was twice employed. I should have been counted twice in the statistics. That's what I'm 100% sure.
Yeah, that's what. So I should double my numbers for women, I think. If it is 10%, I should say 20%.
So just one small, really bad question. Again, really, I'm sorry I'm asking the worst questions possible. Women at home do not draw a salary. But today, like my wife, okay, she's a stay-at-home mom, but she's extremely critical to the well-being of the family, me and my daughter. And I don't think my daughter would be anywhere near as productive as a human being if not for my wife. And same with me. I think I would be probably earning 30%, 40% less if I didn't have this beautiful support structure that she manages. But do we not account for this in the kind of the numbers that throw out? How does this work?
So we need to understand the difference between work and employment. So we all work all the time. Even when, in the olden days, you would shut work in the office and go home, maybe you would do some work at home. Maybe you could run the dishwasher or the washing machine, or you could, hopefully do some other useful work at home as well. So that's work. But employment is different. Employment is when you're employed for wages or for profit. Work is, I may say, for love. And we need to distinguish the two, because let's say, we calculate growth We calculate well-being when there is a greater division of labor, greater specialization of labor, and when all kinds of working age people are engaged in professional activities. That's when you have that very substantial improvement in the quality of life. I don't think it's desirable for us to go back to a world where you're washing your clothes, you're cooking your food, you're probably growing your food, you have hen and chicken in the backyard. That's not the world we want to go back to. We want to go and buy eggs and chicken from the market. We don't want to become farmers going back. So in the spirit of economic development, it is desirable that women do get employed in the labor force. It would be a very skewed society otherwise. We wouldn't get an Indira Nooyi, for example.
True, absolutely. And I think the world wars first brought the women into the workforce and in the Western countries, and they refused to go back. And I think the magical productivity growth when just 50% of your population is contributing, it's just crazily big and beautiful. It's interesting. I have one question for you on this. And sorry, I know I'm asking too many questions. And Rajesh will come to it. When your statistics and government statistics don't match, how much fun is it?
I would.
And one more thing. And your statistics don't match, and the government doesn't like it.
Okay, so I think I had this long spat with the government, let's call it with government economists, that they went on a spree trying to discredit the numbers being put out by me. And I can sit back today and say that I was proven right. So I can say it was fun, but not when I was in the shit. So it's quite tense when you're there, right there, and government officials kind of breathing down your neck, and media saying, but they're saying you're wrong, and people asking you inane questions, deliberately asking you stupid questions. So it was tough. It was fun. I can say after the battle is over, when the government finally released the data they were holding back, they found that the government data was saying more or less the same things that we were saying. So today, the government, for example, estimates unemployment rate on a quarterly basis for urban India and annually for India as a whole. It's called the Periodic Labor Force Survey now. The PLF's estimates are more or less in line with the CMI estimates. So the battle is over. We are at peace. We are both saying the same things. And now we should move to solving the problem rather than quibbling over the numbers. We have had similar things with many other state governments also in the past. Happily, in most cases, or in most all the cases, we have come out pretty good in those battles with the government.
Mahesh, looking ahead, in terms of, when you look at progress in the economy, if there was one North Star metric that we should be tracking as a country in an economy to make sure we are making progress towards wealth creation, towards prosperity, what do you think that number would be? There are a lot of candidates. I mean, like you said, women's labor force participation, GDP growth, or the total GDP, or maybe inequality, all kinds of numbers are there. And to a layperson, you get so many numbers on a regular basis, unemployment rate, etc. How do we know that we are moving in the right direction? So if there was one number, which one do you think we should be tracking?
We are not so far, that number is not used in India as yet. But I think what we should certainly look at is per capita household incomes. So when you look at GDP, it contains a lot that does not necessarily accrue to households of India. So, I think it's important for us to look at household incomes and be sure that household incomes are rising. And once you say the metric is household income, per capita household income. Basically, people should be earning more. What are we trying to say when we say per capita GDP? We are trying to say what are our income levels. But I'm saying per capita GDP is not good enough. It should be per capita household income. Finally, what matters is people. It's not the country. I mean, I don't think the country is important as much as the people of the country is important. So we should measure per capita household incomes, and we should look at 5 basic metrics of this. So what is the per capita household income? What is its median value? So how many people, half the people are below, half the people are above this. That median value needs to be moving. What are the 2 quartiles around it? And what is the inequality ratio, the Gini coefficient? So we need to be sure that the country is growing and that growth is leading to less inequitable distribution. So whatever the inequality be today, we are not quarreling over that. What is important is to ensure that the growth is not on a sustained basis, at least, highly inequitable. So per capita household income and its distribution. If you look at that, we will be able to measure correctly what is the progress that the country is making.
It's a great point. I remember, I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago that I had asked you this exact question. I was working on this Nai Disha and Dhanwapasi project. And I think if I remember correctly, at that time, the estimate that you had given was the monthly per capita household income was in the order of about 10,000 rupees.
Right.
So about 1.2 lakhs for a family for a year. And it's astonishingly low when you think about it, that a whole family has to live in 10,000 rupees. I think that was the, if I'm not wrong, that was probably the median number. I forget. You'll have the better answer to that.
It was the median number. I remember you were shocked with that number.
Yeah.
And I admire you for all the inferences you drew from there. Yes. And policy prescriptions you made from there.
So how is that number looking today?
Well, not looking at the pandemic.
Yes.
It did rise. And it continued to rise. But after the pandemic, it's fallen very sharply. And the numbers are like 12 to 13% lower than a year ago. So the hit was about 25% fall in incomes. That's repaired a bit, but we are still about 12 to 15% low compared to a year ago.
And now this is very important because when the sort of, and this is the median number. So you have 50% or more of households in India effectively who are at lower incomes. And that's sort of the challenge before us as, before the country as for the policymakers, that you effectively, instead of people being say at from 100 to 110 or 115, they're probably gone to 75, which means maybe 2 or 3 years of loss really of growth. And that has serious implications. And when you look ahead, how, I mean, this is, I think, perhaps the most important aspect, that how do you make an understanding of these numbers and sort of tracking this on a regular basis very central to our consciousness as a country? Because I mean, we all talk about comparisons with China, and I mean, we are doing even not so good even with Bangladesh in terms of some of the social numbers, etc. But how can, you know, if people become more conscious in terms of policy making, etc., what do you think if resources were no constraint for you? What do you think as CMIE would love to do going forward to get this sort of energy behind ensuring greater and faster prosperity?
So CMIE is not into policy prescription, so I wouldn't go anywhere there. But I would certainly like to go and address the issue of measuring this. But the problem is that official statistics do not capture this data. They do not capture household incomes. They capture GDP from the supply side, and they don't look at household incomes at all. Official statistics mix households with others that are not exactly households. So the first problem is to measure this. So I may stake some claim in not a very humble way that I made a difference to the narrative in the country regarding employment and employment. I brought that to the fore. And now there is some attention to that willy-nilly, that the government has to pay attention. At least they have to in the manifesto say that they will take care of unemployment. Even if they don't do anything about it, everyone will say, we will give you jobs, we will give you jobs, we will give you jobs. So there's some measure over there now.
A lot of times it's not even jobs, it will give you some unemployment dole.
Yeah, right. So that's come to the fore. I will, in the next few months, hopefully in this financial year, release household income level data and start a narrative on that and speak about it. Hopefully, that will lead to some consciousness and some improvement in our demands on what do we expect the country to do for us.
Fantastic, Mahesh. I think it's been an incredible journey over the last hour. Listening to you, I think amazing stories about the India behind the numbers, really. We look at all these numbers, just glaze over it, 5.8, 10.1. But I think what you're doing really is helping bring these numbers to life. More power to you. Jamit?
I think it's been an absolutely brilliant session, Mahesh. I understood a lot about economics. I understood a lot about numbers. And you're right. It's in some ways, the numbers holds the conscience of the nation. If the nation is about progress, it's about people. If you can't measure it, if you don't understand what to measure and how you're measuring those numbers, you don't know what your metrics are as a nation. You don't know what you're voting for. You don't know what to aim for. These numbers are a mirror that show that how we are actually doing, because the numbers help drive the narrative, and the narrative fundamentally will drive the regime. And that allows us to pick and choose and evaluate the regime on these numbers. And you require an independent body. So while at the start, Rajesh spoke about the government job to give numbers, sometimes I believe it is so important that the government should not be in the job of these numbers. It is a public good, but it is a private enterprise to provide this public good. Probably the role of the government is to buy it from you, because there is an independent authority that is not, let's say, influenced by the outcome of those numbers. And that becomes important when more power to people like you to bring out these numbers, employment numbers. And that's the whole role of private enterprise, to push and to figure it out. I'm sure you're doing it not just for charity, but there are people who want to use it and want to figure it. And that drives these narratives. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And today, you know what, I look at it, Mahesh, and look at you, and I call you the Sherlock Holmes of numbers, because you know why? Because I'm reminded of a quote, and it's very interesting. When you look at those numbers and you're trying to glean those insights, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And whenever you give those two stories, I just think it's just that it looks impossible. How the hell is it happening? And when you eliminate it and the data is right and it's speaking to you, whatever is left over, however improbable, is what you gleaned out. And I think that's a big lesson. And this is something that I take. Every hippoBrain changes me. This has changed me also fundamentally in understanding a lot of it. Thank you. It's been a brilliant session.
Well, thank you for all the kind words, Jamit. It is very encouraging to hear these. And thank you for wishing CMI more power. We will take that very seriously, and hopefully we will continue to throw more light on the data. And Jamit, you're right. If you can't measure it, you can't understand it. And then you can't do anything about it. So it's been great talking to you guys. Great fun. Thank you so much for inviting me on this.
Thank you. And to all our listeners, of course, do subscribe. We have many such hippoBrains. Mahesh is up there as the hippoest of hippoBrains. And I think it's been amazing. Thanks a lot. Do subscribe, do like us.